In this graveyard of empires, its people have been forced into a life of resilience. Afghanistan is the first country the United States targeted in its so-called war on terror. But 15 years later, the country is in crisis.
The government is not functioning properly.
There's endemic corruption, an economy run on foreign aid, and the drug trade.
It's really hard to describe just how awful this situation is. It's just a sea of misery.
Drug addiction has entrapped more than 10% of the population. And an insurgency that grows more menacing day by day. I'm Soraya Leni, and I've come to Afghanistan to find out why the state is failing and why the insurgency is growing. Blood runs freely in Afghanistan, but here it's spilled willingly. We've come to the capital's west, where Shia Muslims are commemorating Taswa Ashura, the anniversary of the death of Imam Hussein in 680 AD.
There's blood flying absolutely everywhere, and some people are bleeding so badly that they have to be dragged away.
This is actually a sign of progress. Shia Muslims are a minority, around 15% of the population. And under the Taliban, they could not commemorate this occasion in public. But although they can now, they face threats from extremist groups. Still, the most faithful will not be moved.
احساس که امام حسین میدونست در کربلا که من در محاصره هستم شهید میشم ولی میدونست که این شهادت خودش فیروزی است ترس از انتحار انفجار هیچ چیزی نداره.
As quickly as blood is spilled, it's washed away. Normal in an abnormal place. Kabul is a bustling city, but it's also one that's hiding from itself. Barricades, blast walls and checkpoints separate the influential classes and the government from the people. A government of unity, but in name alone. It operates with a president, Ashraf Ghani, and a chief executive, Abdullah. But it's paralysed by bitter political disagreements. This government took over from Hamid Karzai, who led the country after the US invasion in 2001. And in that time, the US has given the country more than $113 billion, more money than it spent rebuilding Western Europe after World War II.
President Karzai could have become a transformational leader in order to transform Afghanistan from an archaic and obsolete society. Our failure was perhaps the bad governance, corruption.
It's so bad here, a classified NATO report leaked in 2012 concluded Afghan civilians frequently prefer Taliban governance over the Afghan government, usually as a result of corruption. Most of the country still lacks adequate electricity, running water, paved roads, and other basic services. According to US government audits, Washington doesn't know how almost half of the aid money was spent.
83% of MPs are involved in corruption. They are warlords, they threaten people.
Still, the country is dependent on foreign aid. In October, donors promised a further $15 billion, even though the Afghan government has not met previous conditions to fight corruption. But while the country's senior leadership made its case in Brussels, reality is at home, overshadowed any talk of missing funds. The Taliban had overrun the northern city of Kunduz for the second time in a year. The Taliban holds more territory now than at any time in the past 15 years. 31 out of 34 provinces are in a state of conflict or chaos. And 4 provincial capitals are close to collapse. The most problematic is Lashkargah, the capital of Helmand province. Insurgents already control around 85% of the province, yet this is the government's line.
I assure the residents of Helmand, in particular Al Afghan, that Lashkargah or Helmand will not fall to the enemy.
The Afghan government say the Taliban is now receiving unprecedented support from its traditional backers in Pakistan in a war that has gone from covert to overt. What's more, Daesh has emerged as a threat in other provinces. Civilians are often caught in the crossfire. According to the UN, 5,166 civilians were killed and wounded in the first 6 months of this year, the highest toll since the UN began counting in 2009. The same is true for soldiers and police.
We're travelling on the main road between Pakistan and Afghanistan. It's the Kabul-Jalalabad road, but it's known to many as the Highway of Death. That's because most of the suicide bombings that happen in and around Kabul happen here. There's a UN base, a US base, and the main training facility for the Afghan army. That means every day there are a lot of targets moving up and down this road.
Around 6,000 security personnel have been killed this year alone. More soldiers and police are dying or deserting quicker than the government can recruit. A fact not lost on these men working a snap checkpoint. Anywhere there is a uniform, there is a threat.
نه و از هیچ کس ما به هیچ نوع ترس نداریم به خاطر از اینکه این لباس ما به تن کردیم در هر گوشه و کنار افغانستان باشیم چی در شهر کابل باشیم چی در هر گوشه و کنار افغانستان باشیم ما صادقانه وظیفه خود اجرا میکنیم.
With security failing, leaders out of the country and a shura taking place, it's a sensitive time. Just hours later, gunfire erupted in the west of the city. Worshippers at the Kartasakhi Mosque were under attack. And again, one procession of mourning was replaced by another. By the light of day, 18 people were dead, including women and children. The wounded are taken here to emergency hospital. Georgia shows us around. There are 20 patients from the shrine attack here, and 18 more from other areas where there's been violence. The hospital is at capacity, and everyone is exhausted.
It's from yesterday evening, 7:30 that we don't stop.
How do you feel?
Like every day in Afghanistan. One day is Kabul, one day is Logar, one day is Ghazni, one day is Tagabu. I mean, there is no peace.
Outside, we meet Zakir, whose brother is lying in the ICU. He narrowly escaped the shrine attack.
در کل افغانستان وضعیتش خراب است. یک لحظه شم اعتبار نیست.
Worsening security has led to a national exodus. Last year alone, 213,000 Afghans fled to Europe. Millions more already live as refugees in neighboring Iran and Pakistan.
I'm planning to leave the country and go abroad for living. I have studied in one of the best, or I can say the best university in Afghanistan. And I have a very good job with very good income. I have home, car, and everything here. But my security is not insured here.
For law student Ahmad, the last straw was August 24, 2016. He was here at Kabul's American University when gunmen opened fire.
Me and 3 friends of mine, we were sitting in front of the building on the back of which the attack happened. They attacked everyone in the university. They were just blindly shooting on everyone.
And this was carried out despite all the security. Even members of parliament know there's something fundamentally wrong here, spending money on blast walls, but not to fight the destructive ideology that makes security necessary in the first place.
The majority of money goes to bullet, goes to fighting against extremism or terrorism, rather than to spend this money on pen, on books, on school, on teachers. So until we are like stuck in this kind of undefined war, so definitely our children will suffer.
A lesson the US-led coalition has slowly realised. You can't bomb an ideology. After 15 years of fighting, the United States has pulled out most of its troops, and now it supports peace talks with the Taliban. As we talk to Shinkai Karokhail, the paradox of the politics here becomes obvious. Over her shoulder sit senior members of Hizb Islami, the party of warlord Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. Officially, they're terrorists with ideology akin to the Taliban. Still, their affiliates form the largest bloc in the Afghan parliament. Now Hizb Islami and the government have signed a peace deal, making it very likely these men here will also become elected officials.
حزب اسلامی افغانستان پرسابقه ترین تنظیم سیاسی افغانستان است که تقریباً 50 سال قدامت داره و یگانه حزب سیاسی در کشور است که فرا ملیتی، فرا زبانی، فرا قومی، فرا مذهبی.
So will Hizb Islami run a candidate in the coming presidential elections?
وقتی ما به مبارزه سیاسی رو میاریم هر در و هر احتمال باز است و ممکن است.
But as old foes come back into the political fold, new ones have emerged. Daesh has claimed responsibility for the shrine attack. It's this constant carnage that keeps the dirt turning here. One funeral, then another. There is no stability. No matter how much money is spent, how many lives lost, from behind its fortress of walls, the government can barely secure the capital, let alone anywhere else. And all of this war to bomb away an ideology which has still managed to find popular support. The trauma goes on, generation after generation, in an illogical war that seems to stretch on forever. Soraya Leni in Afghanistan for the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is Zubair Iqbal. He's an adjunct scholar at the Middle East Institute. Thanks so much for joining us, sir. Afghanistan, 15 years on since the US-led invasion. Thousands of lives have been lost. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent. Has it been worth it?
Well, it depends. It's in the eye of the beholder. As far as I can see, the cost has been a bit too excessive for the objectives that were aimed to be achieved. Remember that the objectives have been changed over time many times, and now we are at a situation where the US and the allies would like to maintain their presence over there in order to ensure stability in the region. And the cost involved, they believe, is not so expensive. It's about $18 to $20 billion a year, which they think is justified in order to be able to sustain a degree of stability in the region and hope that Afghanistan eventually will have a stable, self-sustaining government in place.
Tell me what you think President Ghani is doing right.
I wish I could. The problem is that Mr. Ghani has a challenge in front of him, which is not of his making. Here is a country which was never united from a cultural point of view. At the same time, there was a considerable degree of independence and autonomy for the various regions of the country. On top of that, now you have an ethnic and a religious conflict. That conflict has taken a life of its own, and Mr. Ghani does not have the capacity or the resources to be able to handle it. Remember that 80 to 90% of government's expenditure is met by financing from outside, and at the same time, up to 100% of all its expenses on armed forces and security are borne by the foreigners. Now remember, if under these circumstances and little or no growth in the economy, if the outsiders were to withdraw, the economy will simply collapse, and with that, the government. And that is something that Mr. Ghani cannot handle, nor is he in a position to be able to do it.
Between 2001 and now, who failed more? Was it the international community, the NATO, ISAF, US forces, or was it the incompetence of the Afghan governments themselves?
Well, everybody has a share in it. Remember, the initial objective was to get rid of the Al-Qaeda from there, and then to restore a degree of stability and a stable government, which would be acceptable to everybody. And then came the issue of how do you establish the stability, political stability in the region, where various parts of the society, including Taliban, were not interested in compromising. So under these circumstances, everybody has to take the blame. Quite clearly, when the external forces moved in, US and NATO forces moved in, their assumption was that they are in a position to contain the conflict and restore a government that will come into power and will be able to stabilize the place. It didn't work for the simple reason that they did not reach the opposition to work out a political compromise. Now we have a state where the economy is not growing, where political conditions have become worse, where the potential compromise between the Taliban and other forces and the government has become more and more remote. So at this moment, if you were to look at it in hindsight, you realize that all the efforts that were made earlier did not produce the results that were needed, and therefore not particularly worth the expenses and the lives that were lost.
Mm-hmm. We're at a stage where the Taliban is eating up substantial amounts of land in the country, and they've got a fair amount of support from a lot of people who live under them in some of these provinces. The government only controls about, what, two-thirds of the country. Now, former President Karzai has said that unlike Daesh, who are an external threat, who are injecting themselves into this country, much like Al-Qaeda in the past, that the government needs to treat the Taliban a little bit differently, particularly those young people who join them as soldiers, because these are, to quote Hamid Karzai, these are sons of the soil. Do you agree with that approach, that the Taliban has to have a separate approach? Tell me why you don't.
No. And let me tell you why. Because to say that Taliban are distinct from other quote-unquote external forces is a fallacy. Taliban, I agree, were developed by the domestic forces and the domestic conflicts that started to emerge after 2001. And in fact, more so after 1995, after the Russians had left. However, remember that they were supported and financed by external forces, including Al-Qaeda and other similar forces from the Middle East, from the Gulf region in particular. So to assume that these two are independent of each other is not right. I agree that most of the Al-Qaeda forces have moved out, but the Al-Qaeda principles and the Al-Qaeda philosophy has become ingrained in the Taliban. And therefore, it is necessary to reach out to the Taliban, not simply as quote-unquote sons of the soil, but somewhat more than that, because they are still beholden and dependent upon external forces, upon Al-Qaeda and financing from elsewhere. Therefore, a regional solution has to be sought. And Mr. Karzai's presumption is just a presumption. It doesn't work. If it had to work, it could have worked in his own time when he was president.
Right. There was a massive drawdown of troops under President Barack Obama, from 100,000 plus to about 8,500 now. So the US is not fully engaged, nor is it fully disengaged. In many ways, President Obama has kicked the can down the road, and now Donald Trump has to pick it up. What do you think Trump needs to do for the better, not of the United States, but for the betterment and the improvement of Afghanistan? What do you want Trump to do?
Well, let's face it. Every country has its own national interest and pursues that. That's exactly what the United States would do, irrespective of whether they like it or not. Mr. Trump has shown that he is more aggressive and more direct in resolving these issues and addressing these issues than other leaders of the United States, the previous presidents, as well as potential candidates who could have defeated him. So under these circumstances, I don't expect that Mr. Trump will be looking at it from the point of view of what's good for Afghanistan. He'll be looking at it from the point of view of what is good for the United States and the US policy in the region as he sees it or as his supporters see it. That is a very complicated matter because now Afghanistan has become the sort of a focal point of regional conflict where Pakistan and India, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Central Asian countries, all of them have their own interests and vital interests. Under these circumstances, any US effort or initiative to resolve the problem will have to bring these countries along, particularly Pakistan, which is a direct neighbor and most affected by what happens in Afghanistan. Therefore, under these circumstances, I don't expect the US to do more at this moment than it is doing, because at this moment, the cost benefit of what the US is doing is reasonably okay, and the US government can live with it, while it tries to gradually look for something else to happen. Now, remember that Middle East has become a powder keg, and US focus is largely on fixing up the Middle East before it blows up. Similarly, its concerns about the pivot to Asia requires a lot more resources, and therefore less resources available to be able to conduct a conclusive, effective political solution or a military solution in Afghanistan. Therefore, I don't see much of a change in policy, at least in the near future.
Zubair Iqbal, good to get your thoughts. Thank you very much for joining us.